afternoon. Thanks for joining us. We have a very special guest today, Warren Irwin, CIO of Rosseau Asset Management. I think it's been about 2 years since we did an interview or anything like that. So really excited to get Warren's thoughts on the market currently. I think we'll talk a lot about commodities today. For anyone that's participating, feel free to enter any questions in the Q&A box and we'll address those. But yeah, just really looking forward to having a chat with Warren. So thanks for joining us, Warren. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Deborah.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. So where are you right now?
I'm in an undisclosed location, working on a top secret assignment. If I told you, I'd have to kill you. Sorry about that. But I'm in a hotel room, just traveling and working on some deals. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Warren, you've been in the industry, I think, for 37 years now. How do you think that the investment landscape looks today? Like, what market dynamics have changed? Like, how do you view the world currently?
Yeah, I don't think it's. I think anybody of my vintage will probably talk. Whenever I talk to anybody of my vintage, I said, "Have you ever seen the world this crazy?" And they go, "No." We have never seen the world. I'm 58 and I've never seen the world this crazy by a long shot, right? And so, I've had almost 60 years on this earth and wackiest times I've ever seen. So many wacky things happening like all at once. Things might have been, obviously things were pretty wacky back in the 40s with the Second World War. They might have been kind of wacky maybe during the Vietnam War, early 70s with the oil embargo from the Middle East, inflation. But, to have all the things happening right now all at once, like even last year, I would have said things are the craziest I've ever seen them. And they've gone from crazy like to where they are today, which is super crazy. And the nonsense going on and trying to even predict what one can do with their portfolio is very, 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 very difficult. That's for sure. And
what are you doing with your portfolio currently? Do you have a lot of exposure to commodities?
Yeah, I'm 100% exposed to commodities, mainly metals, but I also have some oil. And so the metals I'm exposed to mostly are met coal. Everybody knows, I'm a shareholder in Colonial Coal. That's sort of a deep value, high quality play in the met coal space, one that's out of favor due to, naive environmentalists / woke investors who have no clue as to how the world works. And then I'm also involved in a more in favor business, which is copper and nickel. And it's really fascinating. Like one of the weirdest things going on right now in the metals market is, let's say during the 90s, during the metals boom in the 90s, well, we didn't have a bunch of woke, politically correct, virtue signaling, idiotic politicians telling us what metals we can invest in, which ones we can invest in, which ones we could sell to the Chinese, which ones we can't sell to the Chinese, which ones we should go after, and which ones we should not go after. And it's frankly completely and totally outrageous that we have these clowns that have never had any experience in the metals business, and all of a sudden they're making these decisions. For instance, the Canadian government, I was not a shareholder of Neolithium, but to have the Canadian government state that, put the rules in place after that deal saying that Canadian companies cannot sell their strategic metals projects to the Chinese state-owned corporation or one that's partially owned by the state. If those rules were in place prior with Neolithium, in fact, what the Canadian government is doing, and we're talking these guys are willy-nilly putting these rules in place, they're basically taking extraterritorial control by saying to Argentina, we control who your resources should be sold to, which is completely outrageous, frankly. Can you imagine having Argentina tell Canada, we're not going to let an American company buy your potash mine in Saskatchewan? Like, what's going on, frankly, is completely and totally outrageous. And to try and invest in this climate, it's getting increasingly tricky because, for instance, with my involvement with met coal, let's say 6 years ago, met coal, there was the good guys, right? We need met coal to make steel. You need steel to make windmills. You need steel to make solar panels. You need steel to make Teslas. And there's no substitute for it. It's not like thermal coal. And a lot of these people making these rules don't understand the difference between thermal coal and met coal. But they're saying coal is bad. Well, coal is not bad. Met coal is used to make steel. They've been using met coal to make steel for 120 years. It's the technology that they use. There is no substitute for us. Sure, people say green hydrogen, but try and find green hydrogen. Like, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen, right? And over time, we'll find technologies to reduce the CO2 emissions from making steel. But over the foreseeable future, if we need steel, and we do need steel, we'll need met coal. And we have high quality met coal in Canada, which is good on the emissions front because it's such high quality coal. It doesn't have a lot of the nasties other coals have. And but meanwhile, you get lumped in with, oh, you're bad because, but we're not bad because we're not the ones that are used to burn to make thermal coal. And then, of course, let's talk about thermal coal for a second. We're running around in North America, and let's say in Canada, we're shutting down all our coal-fired power plants, which is, I believe, a good thing. But they're building one or two every week in China. So if we think we're going to change the world or save the world, it's a complete fallacy. And it's just the amount of ignorance and the amount of panic that the governments are trying to instill in people about this ESG climate change is completely outrageous, and not unlike the outrageous moves of the governments with respect to COVID. When that panic happens, it seems like the governments today want to panic everybody in the world about a global climate emergency, and then they want to make all these knee-jerk legislation which will solve the problem, and they won't solve the problem. All it does is just make it worse for everybody. So it's a bit of a dangerous time. The politicians feel they need to have a panic population on their hands, and that the politicians will quell their fears by having all the answers and making broad brush, rather dumb legislation, which hurts everybody. Not unlike what they did with COVID.
Going back to your thoughts on met coal, what do you think of the recent Teck spinoff and the Glencore bid?
Well, I think Teck could be a poster child for ESG money laundering. When you think about it, it's completely and totally outrageous what Teck is doing. Like, it is just the ultimate in wokeness and political correctness and ESG. So what happens is Teck's under a lot of pressure from a lot of these large US funds, okay, saying, well, you can't be producing met coal. Well, first of all, the people making these rules probably don't know the difference between met coal and thermal coal. So they're labeling all coal bad, right? So that's the first step. So Teck, instead of standing up to them and spending some time explaining to the world that there's a difference between met coal and thermal coal. Thermal coal, there's a replacement for it. It's called wind, solar, hydro, nuclear. Okay, there's lots of options to replace thermal coal. There's only one fantasy option to replace met coal, which is right now green hydrogen, which really doesn't exist in any meaningful quantities. And that's one technology, but there's probably a few others which will work over time, but they'll be phased in over time, right? So Teck is under tremendous pressure to be politically correct. So they're saying, okay, well, we're not going to spend the time explaining to you how met coal is the good coal, but we'd rather just jettison our met coal and go focus on copper. So let's take the easy road out, and then we'll get all the stupid ESG funds investing in our company. But then they're going, well, this is where the money laundering comes in. You spin out your bad, or whatever these guys think of met coal, which is they don't want Teck to own the met coal. So they spin it off, but then Teck says, well, we don't like owning the met coal, but we really like the cash flow generated from it. So we're going to strip out 90% of the cash flow from this new spin out. So then you have this new spin out. Why would anybody invest in it when 90% of your cash flow is being stripped out of it for the next several years? And you have your hands are tied with respect to expanding in the met coal business, right? So that is truly a weak-kneed move on the part of Teck. Teck just stood up, saying, listen, we're a long-term provider of quality met coal to steel mills around the world to make steel, the steel that we will need to build the mining trucks, to mine the copper we're going to need, to build the solar panels, to build the Teslas. We need met coal to do all the things we need for the energy transition. But instead of standing up to all these ESG idiots who really don't understand coal, they took the easy way out. And is the world any better off? Like the coal is still going to get mined. It's just going to be mined by different people. So how is that helping Teck? How is that helping the world? It's not. It's hurting Teck, and it's not helping the world in any degree. And so that's hence where they're basically doing one of the most outrageous things I've seen in this market, because they don't have the stomach to, or the will to try and get some of these woke individuals to understand the difference between met coal and thermal coal and how met coal is needed. And anyways, there. That's sort of where we are. It's crazy, frankly, what Teck has just done.
And then Glencore, what are your views there?
Yeah. Well, just as you thought things were crazy, you go, I've seen this happen a few times. I remember we had a large American fund came up to Canada to try and take on Frank Stronach with Magna. Magna had multiple voting shares. And I'm going, what are these hedge funds doing coming up from the US trying to take over Magna? It's controlled by Frank Stronach. He doesn't want to sell. And they're saying, well, we want board changes, we want this and this. And Frank just goes, no. And, a couple months later, they finally gave up and then walked away with their tail between their legs. And here you got Glencore, okay? You got this new young guy running Glencore. I don't know if he doesn't understand how multiple voting shares work or not, but he's going against the Keevil family who says, we don't want to sell Teck to you, and they have control. So how does this work? And then you talk to Sumitomo, and Sumitomo are amazingly loyal shareholders, and they're going, we're with Mr. Keevil. We're not going to sell. So then where's Glencore now? You don't make an approach to a multiple voting share company and expect to use reason on them to get them to sell something, because if they don't want to sell it, they're not going to sell. And I don't see Teck selling to Glencore. So unless there's a more sophisticated plan on the part of Glencore, I frankly have no clue as to what Glencore is trying to do, going after a multi-vote company that doesn't want to sell. And somehow are they going to convince all the minority shareholders to rise up against Mr. Keevil and say, you have to sell? And well, that's not going to happen. Everybody knew the deal going in. If you're buying non-voting share or your regular voting shares in Teck, the Keevil family controls it along with Sumitomo. And if they're not going to sell, you have to abide by their wishes, right? So that's another really weird one here. There was some speculation this morning that what Glencore is actually trying to do, and I think it's kind of, I don't understand what Bloomberg is getting at, but who knows? We'll see what happens. But Bloomberg was speculating that Glencore was doing this to actually put Glencore in play, because there have been talks with Ivan Glassenberg not that many years ago, when he was going to merge with BHP, right? So maybe they're trying to put Glencore in place, so BHP will take them out. But there's some nutty stuff going on, and let's just see how it all plays out. But first thing nutty was Teck spin out of Elk Valley, and then nothing wrong with spinning out Elk Valley if you want to be full ESG, whatever you want to be, but don't suck and blow. If you're going to spin it out, you've got to let Elk Valley keep the cash flow and let them expand the met coal business. And if you want the cash flow, well, then you got to hang on to it. But they're trying to have the cake and eat it too. Spin it off, you keep the cash flow, which is reasonably outrageous in my opinion. Yeah.
And the horse that you're backing in the met coal space is Colonial Coal, which you referenced. Why do you like that stock?
Yeah, it's
And full
pretty much.
disclosure, just so everyone knows, I own some, and we also
Yeah.
look at Colonial
Yeah,
Coal.
you own some, I own some. Yeah, and it's a fascinating little story, and it's really what's neat about it though is it's there's a significant amount of retail holding this stock. So if we're able to get this thing sold, it'll be a big win for retail, which will be great. But yeah, met coal is not well understood in Canada and in the world, frankly. The likelihood of having a pure play junior met coal company, my understanding, I have not come across another junior met coal player, certainly in Canada. So it's really pretty much the only way to play it. So if you want to play met coal in Canada, you would have normally played Teck, but Teck has other base metal assets, not just met coal, and you play Colonial Coal. Those are the two ways to play it. And yeah, it's a fascinating story. It's got one of the world's most foremost coal experts, David Austin, running it. He's permitted and built a number of coal mines, sold them for billions and hundreds of millions of dollars. He's well recognized and respected in the met coal business. And he has two extraordinary projects in northeastern British Columbia that produce a high quality coal that the Japanese are used to using. There's rail infrastructure, support of First Nations who want some prosperity in their region. So it'll be fascinating to see how that happens. David, in his most recent interview, I forget who was interviewing him at the time, but he said there's 17 NDAs. So rarely does a company that I've owned up for sale have 17 NDAs. So there's lots of interest in it. So we'll see how that plays out. Recently, there's been some level of speculation that things are heating up. In the northeastern British Columbia, there's been a lot going on. Canuma bought Teck's Quintet assets, which, if I was Teck, I would have built it. I wouldn't have sold to Canuma, but that's, of course, I'm not running Teck. And then there's speculation that Anglo might be a seller, might be a buyer of some coal assets in the region. The Sikunka project was turned down because of caribou issues. Colonial doesn't have the caribou issues, so that leaves Glencore without the source of coal they were expecting. So there's speculation that Glencore was going to buy some met coal assets, and obviously they're going to try and take a swing at Teck, which I don't think will work. So after that fails, don't know where they're going to get their met coal from. So there's some speculation they may have an interest in Northeast coal. The Japanese steelmaker that would partnered with Glencore, they're not getting the steel, they're steelmaking coal they were expecting. So there's lots going on in the region, frankly, and I would think there's been more happen in the last 6 months in met coal in British Columbia than in the past, 6 years. It's really an exciting time, and we're seeing some speculation in the stocks because people think something may happen. Because the big thing for met coal, right, is you're looking at both China and India are looking at doubling production, and frankly, India does not have a good source of domestic met coal, so they need to go international. And China has some of the same issues, right? They have more met coal than India does, but they don't have the internal capacity to meet the demand for met coal, and hence to create the steel production they're going to need. So those are the two big ones. And then, of course, you got the Japanese and the Koreans, steelmakers are looking for met coal. So the world is looking for met coal. David Austin, Colonial Coal, has a met coal. It is up for sale. There's 17 NDAs signed. We'll see how that ends up. It's anyone's guess as to how that'll work out.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people think that we're at the beginning of a mining cycle or a bull run in metals. What do you think about that? Do you agree?
My gut's telling me that for sure. And the big win for me would be I have a number of discoveries from the previous cycle, as in I'm a big shareholder in SolGold. We made one of the world's top copper discoveries in Ecuador, so we're trying to get that sold. There's no, it's well known, it's up for sale. Colonial Coal is up for sale. And I have some other, obviously some other big metal positions, but they're in the development stage. They're just gradually building resources. Certainly they're not ready for sale yet. So I'm hoping to sell some of my bigger positions like SolGold and Colonial, and then have that cash ready to invest in the next mineral cycle. The issue, of course, though, that's scaring me a little bit, even as a reasonably seasoned investor in the mining sector is the amount of government interference that's happening here is really scaring me, because you never know how it's going to play out. And in the old days, you just go out there. Your big risk was geological risk, or you go out there and you fund some drill programs, and you'll find something or you won't, and you'll go on to another project. But now you've got a significant amount of geopolitical and political risk. So you're dealing with political risk from not only the government telling you what you can and cannot mine, what you can and cannot sell, and who you can and cannot sell it to, right? Like with the Canadian legislation, not being able to sell strategic metals to the Chinese. Then you've got some other restrictions. Sweden was going to lift, let's say, uranium mining ban, which, again, talk about things that shouldn't be in place. So Sweden is a very unique situation. They're looking at expanding the number of nuclear reactors. They've figured out the plan, which is nuclear power is needed to power their country, to not generate CO2. Yet they did not pass a bill which was going to allow for uranium mining and make Sweden self-sufficient in uranium, which would have made, to me as a mining guy, a reasonable amount of common sense, right? So that got turned down. There's a mining ban in Brazil, and then the mining ban with respect to uranium in Australia is so confusing. I just can't imagine even anybody figuring that one out. And again, Australia, they're at what point is Australia going to figure out that they need nuclear power plants to generate non-CO2 generating baseload? And wouldn't it be nice if Australia was actually they have one of the world's largest resources of uranium, yet the restrictions on mining uranium are very high and very convoluted, and it's tough to figure out. And then, of course, you find a uranium mine. The Berkeley Energy found a uranium mine in Spain. Of course, that didn't get permitted. And then, so there's all the politicians want clean, safe nuclear energy, but nobody wants to mine uranium yet. So there's a lot of factors where you think you're doing what makes the most sense on a common sense basis, yet politicians go the other way because politicians are politicians. So that's a big, and then so at the top level, the next level, you got some of the community political issues like you're dealing with right now in Chile and Peru. And then you go down to the local region where you're dealing on occasion with local townspeople, indigenous people, whether that be traditional landowners like in Australia, or you're dealing with First Nations in Canada, or other indigenous peoples, which are trying to impact mineral development, either whether stop it or make sure they get their fair share of the profits from it. So when you look at those multiple levels of non-mining risks, which not many years ago were not nearly as large as they are today, it really makes it tricky to try and tick all the boxes politically before you even think about trying to make money mining. So it's really, really tricky. And
Do you think that's one of the... Sorry, go ahead. No, finish your thought.
You'll have to be pretty crafty and pretty on your game here to make money in this cycle, because of all the factors involved and how out of left field you could get some legislation that'll work for you or against you. So it is quite difficult. For instance, anyway, I don't want to get into it, but right now, I think one thing I can state that's obvious and many people may not be aware of, there is a Cold War between the West and China. And China is hooking up with a number of people that were, some of them were foreign allies of the U.S. And the U.S. is the main in the Western alliance, really. So you have like Saudi Arabia, cutting a peace deal with Iran. Of course, it was interesting how media in the West did not pick up any of that prior to it actually happening. Chinese was a broker for that. You'll also notice that one of the world's sources for a lot of unique metals is South Africa. And South Africa just allowed some Chinese naval ships to enter their waters and dock in Africa. South Africa is leaving the West, from what I could tell, and going to join the Russia-China bloc, right? So all of a sudden the US and the West cannot count on South Africa for their platinum, palladium, any of their rare earths and things like that. So everybody seems to be picking a side here, and you'll have to watch that. Like if a Western investor had invested in South Africa, now what do you do, right? They're now siding with the Chinese. So then how do you deal with that? So there seems to be a race on for some of these critical metals, and the race is heating up, and it could have a lot of unexpected consequences for people who invest in the mineral sector. And interestingly, I'm privy to a number of conversations, and there are very senior global government officials contacting mining companies and trying to guide them as to what they should be mining and where they should be mining it. And that has never happened, to my knowledge, as much as it in the past as it's happening today. So there is a war on for metals, critical metals, battery metals, and things like that. And it could have some unintended consequences in investing.
What do you like in battery metals? What do you think about battery metals in general?
Yeah, the main risk with battery metals is you're dealing with a technology that is reasonably nascent, right? Like I have an order, a diesel pickup truck and 2 gasoline pickup trucks, right? Like I'm not buying into any of this EV nonsense, right? Because I live in the country, and range issues. I live in Canada, so you're dealing with cold issues which impact batteries. The ranges I routinely have to drive, 6, 7, 8 hours, 9 hours. So I can't be sitting around at a charging station for 45 minutes on these trips. And I tow big trailers at times in the wintertime, especially. So you're going to Mountain Pass with a big trailer. The range gets destroyed in, let's say, a Ford F-150 Lightning, right? So electric doesn't make sense for me. So there is, someday it will, but that will involve improved battery technologies. So when I end up buying an electric pickup truck, that'll be the time that, finally we've reached a level where they've dealt with a lot of the battery issues. Electric cars work in the cities. In the countries, they're not nearly as useful, right? So with a situation like that, as time goes on, researchers will try to deal with many of the challenges with electric batteries. One is the cost. So they'll be getting rid of things like cobalt. So anybody out there running around saying, oh, we need cobalt for batteries, well, forget it, because every engineer in the world, it's an exaggeration, of course, but is trying to engineer out cobalt, right? And we're also trying to get down the weight of the batteries, right? So they're trying to minimize the amount of, copper and other metals used in the batteries. Also, there's new technologies where people are trying to get rid of lithium also. So if you're running around saying, oh, I'm going to, you're picking the elements as a neophyte investor, trying to figure out which way the chemistry of batteries are going to be the next 10 years. I think that's a bit of a risky game. So
Plus, some markets are so small for these commodities that 1 or 2 players comes online and pricing gets destroyed.
Yeah, well,
I think it's a risk that people don't talk about.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons, cobalt's not going to be part of the battery future, because what's the number? 80% of it's from the Democratic Republic of Congo, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to base our electric future on the DRC, right? It's just reality, right? Here's a question: is who's the DRC siding with right now? Are they in the Chinese sphere or in the US sphere of influence going forward, right? Like, there's a lot of Chinese operations in Congo. So you don't know where that's going to happen. And if you do rely on some of these metals for batteries, and they do switch from the west to the east or the vice versa. Like China today was threatening to cut off rare earth metals to the Western world, right? I'm not sure if you saw that article. They've done this in the past. So, we've already had enough warning of this, that the West needs to develop our own source of the critical metals, specifically some of the rare earths that are not refined.
Like you referenced with uranium, everyone wants them, but nobody wants to be the country that's mining them.
Yeah, well, the reason the Chinese have a lock on the rare earths is because try and get a rare earth refinery permitted in the US, right? Try and get a copper smelter permitted in the US. Try and get one permit. There's always these NIMBYs, right? They're always running around saying, well, we want electric cars, coal is bad, this is bad, that's bad, but we don't want to have a rare earth smelter in our town. Mm-hmm. But China's been able to smelt all these rare earth metals and refine them. And their environmental standards are obviously not to Western standards. So for anybody trying to do any of this in the West, not only do we have massive permitting hurdles, but at the end of the day, our cost of doing it is way higher. And the buyers are being real pigs, and they're saying, we will go with the cheapest source of this rare earth. Well, guess what? They've been buying from China, and that put everybody in the West out of business, or even stopped anybody in the West from ever building any rare earth smelting refining capabilities, right? So no wonder we're stuck in this position, because everybody was chasing costs down to the bottom. But so in other words, just to summarize, battery metals, it's a tricky place to be. So that's why I don't focus on any of these things like cobalt. I just looking at things like copper. We're going to need copper if we're going to electrify things. Like imagine how much, a nice big thick copper cable that goes from your fuse box to your garage just to charge your stupid electric car, right? Not to mention the multiples of copper electric car uses over internal combustion, right? So that's something not replaceable. And nickel is good. It's always used in stainless steel, and it's also part of the electrification of battery metals complex. And I don't see that being replaced. So those are two that are reasonably safe bets, I think, in the battery space. But we'll see what happens. I'm not a battery expert, and I don't think anybody is, even today, could predict in 10 years what the composition of a Tesla's battery will be.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about base metals and coal and uranium. What about precious metals? What do you think about the prospects for gold and silver right now?
Yeah, well, I've never spent more than 2 seconds thinking about silver. Silver, there's a lot of silver bugs out there. I just go, okay, well, silver, schmilver, whatever. I was invested in and have some exposure to Vizsla Silver, which is, a big discovery in a very rough neighborhood in Mexico. That's one way to play the silver market. Am I speculating on the price of silver? Not really. Silver is a tricky one, because when you're ever dealing with commodities that are byproducts of mining, it can get tricky, because if you have a silver cycle on your let's say your zinc lead mine, and you yank the silver out of the concentrate, you'll do that because it won't cost you very much. You've already mined the ore, and you just have to run it through and yank the silver out, right? So that impacts the economics of a pure silver mine when you've got a bunch of players who will just put a circuit on their circuit on their mine, or however they're going to be smelting it, to yank out the silver, and it'll cost them like $3 maybe an ounce. Whereas if you're a primary silver miner, it may cost you $10 an ounce to mine it. So that plays with the economics, and silver has a significant amount of not only recycling, but also byproduct supply. Gold is interesting. Increasingly, what's happening with the big gold companies, this is a trend everybody should be aware of, is, for instance, Barrick. Let's take a look at Barrick. Barrick, in order for them to bump up their production by any amount, or even replace the reserves they're currently mining, they need big new gold discoveries. And there have not been big new gold discoveries out there, frankly. They're tough to find on a pure gold basis. But where we're finding gold, lots of it, is in things like copper porphyries is one example, where you'll have, let's say, 0.6% copper and maybe, a fraction of a gram gold. So you're getting the gold as a byproduct from mining the copper, right? So for Barrick to buy big copper resources, they'll have to less and less look at primary gold producers and more copper porphyry mines, where only a big gold producer can convert the market's view of it from being a copper mine with gold credits to actually a gold mine with copper credits, right? And you can actually, if you twist the thinking around about it, you could actually have a negative cost of production of the gold, right? So you look at what Barrick is doing. Well, they're going to be developing the Reko Diq mine in the Balochistan province of Pakistan. That's one example where they have a monstrous copper gold porphyry, but they get a bit of copper and they get a lot of gold from it. And if you look at the project we're selling in Ecuador, we have tens of millions of ounces of of gold, which you cannot find that easily on a primary basis, but it's just a byproduct of mining the copper. So the future of gold is, in my opinion, from what I could tell as a junior resource investor, especially in the early stage stuff, the only way we're going to find big quantities of gold is in copper gold porphyries, and the gold majors are figuring this out. So increasingly, we'll see the gold majors, I think, move into copper a little bit.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. We did have an audience question, and I feel like you've answered it throughout the session. But the question was, how come there's such little investment in mineral exploration, given that commodity prices are high? I think you referenced state intervention, different impediments to developing mines, but I don't know if you have a more whole answer for that question.
Yeah. Well, usually, like I've been through a few of these cycles, right? And there's no better way to get people excited in the mining sector than to actually have them make some dough. So what we need some big wins for investors so we could take that money and recycle it. And for instance, if Colonial Coal gets sold, there'd be tons of money being made by the retail investors, and they'll recycle that back in the next new, gold junior or copper junior or some other one. So what you need a big win. For instance, in the 90s, one of the best mining cycles I was involved in, right off the bat, got things rolling really well, was a $4.3 billion win by Diamond Fields. A lot of that went into the hands of retail, right? And then they just recycled that into a whole bunch of other juniors and got the resource cycle going. If you're looking at, they're talking about resource prices being high. Interestingly, I don't think $4 copper is very high, right? I don't think, let's say $6 nickel is very high. Like I remember not that long ago, it might be 10 years ago, nickel was through $30 a pound, right? And here we are 10 years later, it is $6. And copper, $4, does that get me excited? Not really. Things
it's
really
also
haven't
being priced in a much weaker dollar too, right?
Yeah. Well, things aren't heating up quite yet. But there's nothing like getting to get a resource cycle going. We need actually, for people who already have investments in the resource cycle, to get rewarded. So they say, hey, that was good. Let's recycle this money. And that's what we kind of need. We need some, Great Bear was a good success story. Some of that money, I'm sure, was recycled back into the market, but, it was only $1.7 billion, right? When you compare that to like 30 years ago, when Voisey's had $4.3 billion US, which is, it was like $6 billion Canadian, and that was 30 years ago. That today would be worth, $15 billion win, right? So that really makes the Great Bear win seem quite small, right? So we need a big win for investors and get them to recycle it back into the sector. And higher commodity prices wouldn't be all that bad either. I'll give you an example too, which is if you look at met coal prices right now, let's say they're around $400 US a pound. Like, so if you pull the met coal out of the ground, you sell it for $400 US a ton, right? Well, let's say Colonial Coal, let's say it's trading at around, $2. So that's like 40 cents. So you buy the coal in the ground for 40 cents, you mine it and you sell it for $400. Well, there's some pretty significant margin in there, right? But to show you how tough the market is right now, nobody's paying a decent premium for Colonial Coal, even though the underlying commodity is doing fantastic, right? And you take a look at, let's see, even SolGold. SolGold's trading at 16p I sold half my position in 2017 for 50p, right? So it's down, 2/3, despite we're supposed to be in a big copper bull market, right? And we have one of the best copper projects in the world. And then you take a look at Colonial Coal, it's trading at, 40 cents in the ground, where it's trading at $400 once you pull it out of the ground. And all rules of thumb are kind of thrown out of the window, because usually the rule of thumb I've used in the past is an in situ value should be trading around 2 to 3% of what the end product sells for, right? So if you look at even a 2% on $400 US a ton for met coal, it should be $8 a ton, and we're now at 40 cents a ton in the ground. So there's a big disconnect there. And same with SolGold. I'm not sure where SolGold is right now. I would think it's trading at 1.5 cents per pound of copper on something that sells for $4. So we're definitely not being rewarded for having all these metals, despite all the hype about copper, right? Copper's one of the most overhyped metals right now. It's not trading super well, even though the price basis, but even the juniors are not being capitalized at what is reasonable with respect to what they have. So we need a little bit of that to change, and that will change in time. You're seeing it with BHP, I think hitting record highs, and they're generating massive amounts of cash flow. And eventually these mining companies are going to pick off some players, right? And if you get a good price for some players, and they'll recycle it, and then we'll start getting this mining cycle going a little bit more.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So I guess your phone will be busy if Colonial Coal gets sold. All the brokers will be calling you, Warren.
Yeah, right. Just what I need. Yeah. But so when Colonial does get sold, I'll be rolling up my sleeves looking at some new deals. That money will be recycled back into earlier stage projects, and let's hope we're all right, that we've got a cycle brewing. But some of the headwinds, as I mentioned, is just the amount of government political intervention in the mining sector is just really stagnating investment and innovation in the sector. And this is in a sector that people think is the basis for our electrification of the world, which, it's kind of it's a tough place to be.
There's a lot of things that are going to happen before we get there. A lot of things.
Yeah. I'm just hoping the government will still back off a little bit, let the free market get some mines built. But it looks as if they're going to use this as a political opportunity and screw up the mining business here, so we're unable to provide the metals that the world needs to electrify.
Well, they did a great job with the energy business in Canada, so at least they have a framework.
Yeah. Wow, what they've done to destroy the Canadian energy business, unbelievable. The Liberals should have a gold medal for what they've done to do that. But one of my favorite things with respect to unintended consequences is here we are with Greenpeace, right? You've got Greenpeace has been anti-nuclear since the 70s. I remember as a kid, Greenpeace banners right across nuclear power facilities. Well, thanks, Greenpeace. You stopped the development of nuclear power plants in North America in the 70s. So for the past 50 years, we've been burning coal. Thank you very much. And here we are today, where it should be obvious to everybody that we should be going nuclear, and you're still anti-nuclear. So I don't know. And so Greenpeace is, I'm not saying the poster child, but come on, Greenpeace, nuclear is the way to go here. You've been wrong for 50 years. Let's just admit your mistake. Let's get on. Let's stop burning burning thermal coal. I mentioned, not met coal. Stop burning thermal coal. My favorite one too is to show you what the headwinds we're running against, just trying to mine things. Like when we mine copper, we burn diesel fuel, right? So we need Shell to be drilling up oil to give us the fuel we need to power these trucks. And then, of course, we have Greenpeace out there taking their ship that's powered on, bunker oil probably, or diesel, if it's, diesel or bunker, but some petroleum chemical. And they jump in their Zodiacs, which are made out of petrochemicals, powered by gasoline, go up to these oil rigs and complain about Shell being awful in producing oil, which we as miners need to mine the copper to electrify the world.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of that going on, and I don't understand. Greenpeace is the one I think is most delusional, and from what I can tell, I'm sure there's more delusional environmental groups out there, but this is all making it tougher for us mining guys to do what ideally the world wants, which is reduce carbon emissions and produce the metals we need to make the electric vehicles, improve the electrical infrastructure, and build the nuclear power plants to generate the non-CO2 baseload so we could power our lives without burning thermal coal, that is, right? So it's really tough out there, frankly. And so we'll see what happens. And I'll try my best to navigate it, but I'll tell you, I've never seen so many landmines on the way to making money in the mining business than I do see today.
Yeah, it's certainly a tough industry right now. I had one question, which I'm not sure if you're able to answer. In an earlier interview, you referred to a new copper play that you were looking at, but it was too early to talk about. Are you able to talk about it now? Did you end up making an investment?
A new copper play.
I don't know which interview it was. I watched some of your interviews, but not all of them, Warren. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't remember that one. I'm not sure. The only one I would have mentioned possibly was a new nickel play. And I'm involved in Premium Nickel, which has its operations in Botswana. They had a massive.
You did a site visit to South America recently. Perhaps it was that.
Yeah, I went down to see Filo. Filo is kind of too blue chip for me at this stage. I think if you like copper, you should definitely take a look at NGX. They have recently made quite an extraordinary discovery hole in it. I do not own NGX. I've owned NGX in the past. I'm not sure whether I will own NGX or not in the future once I raise some cash, but NGX is probably not a bad spot to be if you're looking at some, a copper junior with some exploration potential there. But
one we work with that's done well is ATEX.
Yeah, I haven't been following that one. My main focus right now, when I get pitched copper deals, what I basically say to them is, we have one of the top 5 copper discoveries in the world, and we're in the process of selling it. So unless until we sell it, I'm not going to be reinvesting in finding some more copper until we find out who we could sell it to. And of course, if I'm finding out, let's say you're looking at a junior copper, you have to ask yourself these questions. What jurisdiction is it in? Are you getting local support? Are you getting indigenous support? Will you be able to mine it? Then who will you sell it to? Well, recently, it's been the Chinese have been buying up all the copper assets that you find, right? So if it's a Canadian listed company and you're not able to sell a copper project to the Chinese, well, then who's going to buy it? And these copper projects require at times billions of dollars to put into production. And you can be just sitting there going, okay, great, we spent all this money, we found a lot of copper and nobody wants to buy us. That's the risk you run. And
if you're right, hopefully it's the major gold companies.
Yeah, well, I know some gold company executives, and they've been asked specifically by the U.S. government to look for copper gold porphyries to increase our copper production. And I don't know. Once you find more copper, then where do you smelt it, right? Like there's a lot of unintended consequences when the politicians start slapping down all sorts of new rules. And then you take a look at China. Well, you want to buy an air conditioner from China that has copper in it? Well, so what are we doing here? We're not allowed to sell copper projects to the Chinese to make the air conditioners that we buy from the Chinese. So there's a lot of unintended consequences, and it definitely makes life very, very difficult for anybody investing in finding copper, because you don't know who you're going to sell it to, and you don't know what new rules will be in place after 3 years of you grinding it out in the jungles to find the place. And it's quite tricky. And sometimes these governments, by putting all these rules in place, they actually stifle investment in the mining industry. So guys like me say, listen, I'm going to take a break from mining for a bit. There's just too many rules, too much government interference. I'll invest in railroads for a while, just to,
I have one last question for you, Warren. I've soaked up more time than I think you had to donate to me today. But so when are you running for office?
No, I have way too many skeletons in my closet, Deborah, to be running for office. It wouldn't take much.
I don't think it matters anymore.
Well, I could use Trump as an example. I don't have as many skeletons as he's got. Like I never, that whole Ritz-Carlton episode in Moscow. Well, I don't have one of those in my background. Trust me. But no, there's no way I'd ever want to be a politician, man. It's not
But that's the problem, right? Anyone that would be good at it doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But we'll see. Hopefully, we'll see what happens here in Canada. I have my hopes as to who will be leading our country the next election. And I think if we do get a change in government, we may have a more pro-Canada government, one that'll actually let us sell our oil and be positive with respect to developing the resources in this country for the benefit of everybody in the country. So, yeah, we'll see what happens.
Well, thanks so much for your time, Warren. Always a pleasure. And thanks everyone for participating. It's great to catch up and get your thoughts on a very challenging market landscape. So look forward to seeing you soon in person.
All right. You take care, Deborah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Irwin.
Goodbye.